Okay, we're connected. You may begin.
That's great. Hello, I am Mary Jones, and I serve as chair of the Marriage and Family Therapy Advisory Committee of the Kansas Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. Today is Friday, October 10th, 2025. I ask the members of the advisory committee to respond to a roll call to signify their presence at this open meeting that's conducted remotely by conference call and other electronic medium. Chris Haben,
Here.
Betsy Anderson,
Here.
Stacy Hodges,
Present.
Renisha Hunter, Marcy Lechtenberg, Diane Stiebel.
And I do see
Here.
Marcy here.
Okay, I thought, yeah.
Here, I was
Okay,
unmuted.
thank you. And Heidi Vella.
I don't
Okay.
see Heidi. I do see
Yeah, I don't
Diane.
either. Okay. Okay, I note the following BSRB staff are also present: David Fye
Here.
and Leslie Allen.
Here.
Next, David will read a message about this meeting being held remotely.
Thank you, Mary. This is David Fye, Executive Director for the Kansas Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. Public comment allows the public to address the advisory committee about any concerns, but the Kansas Open Meeting Act, or the KOMA, does not require the advisory committee to provide public comment or answer questions from individuals. Individuals requesting to provide public comment could contact the executive director prior to the meeting by sending an email to david.fye@ks.gov. No time has been reserved for public comment, as no individuals requested time for public comment. Because we are conducting this public meeting remotely by conference call and other teleconference ability, I state for the record the following information. Public access to this meeting is being conducted by medium of interactive communication that allows members of the public, without cost, to attend the meeting through the use of the conference call or by viewing the board's YouTube channel. While the meeting is conducted remotely, the requirements of the KOMA are not suspended. Therefore, we will be conducting this meeting pursuant to the KOMA. On August 20th, 2025, we sent notice to the advisory committee meeting to all individuals who had requested notice of such meeting. We also posted the notice on the board's website at ksbsrb.ks.gov. You may obtain a copy of the notice at that website. An agenda and other meeting material have been posted on the board's website and are available for review. You may also request a copy of the agenda specifically by sending an email to david.fye@ks.gov with the subject line request for the agenda, and it will be sent to you. The notice contains information for the conference call and YouTube channel that allows the public to attend the meeting free of charge. The notice also states that if we have any technical issues during the meeting, you may call the board office at 785-296-3240 or send an email to bsrb@ks.gov. A recording of the meeting will be available on the BSRB YouTube channel following the conclusion of the meeting by using the link to the meeting on the agenda. And during that introductory information, we did have a couple members log in. So Heidi Vila and also Renisha Hunter are both present. And I did check the conference call line before we got started. There's no one currently on the line, but if I hear someone beep in and introduce themselves, I will let you know.
Thanks, David. I appreciate it. Welcome, Renisha. We'll get to the welcoming of the new advisory committee members in just a minute. I want to start first with our agenda approval. So if you had a chance to look at the agenda that was sent out by David, if there aren't any changes or additions, I'll take a motion to approve the agenda.
I move to approve.
Thanks, Betsy. Chris, were you a second on that?
Yes.
Okay. All those in favor say aye.
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 Any opposed, same sign. Great, thank you. Well, welcome Stacy Hodges and Renisha Hunter to the advisory committee. We're happy to have you. I think before we get started, it might be nice if we could just go around and introduce us to you, and then you can have a little bit of time to tell us about yourselves. I'm Mary Jones, President and CEO of Mental Health America of South Central Kansas in Wichita. I serve as the Marriage and Family Therapy board member to the BSRB and chair the advisory committee. Additionally, I chair the complaint review committee for the Behavioral Sciences Board. I'm going to hand it to, I'm just going to go down my list here. So Chris, you next.
Yeah, good morning. Welcome. My name is Chris Haben. I currently serve as the program director for the Marriage and Family Therapy programs at Friends University in Kansas City and in Wichita, and serve as the division chair for our program here. Also try to keep myself active in doing some private practice work and postgraduate supervision.
Great, thank you. Betsy?
Mhm.
I move to approve.
Thank you.
Second.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Betsy Henderson, committee member. I own a private practice in Prairie Village, and I'm also a clinical supervisor for marriage and family therapy in Kansas and Missouri, and just got my AMFT approved supervisor designation.
Congratulations.
I'm also currently adjunct at UMKC, teaching in the Master's in Professional Counseling program for family systems theory.
Great, thank you. Heidi?
Hi, I'm Heidi Vella. I am a private practice clinician in Manhattan, Kansas. I am also a state approved supervisor and trying to be an AAMFT approved supervisor, but that takes a while. I have historically worked in community mental health for about 9 years, and then I've been in private practice for 5 years, 4 years, something like that. But yeah, I do a lot of clinical work mostly.
Thank you. Marcy?
Hi, Marcy Lechtenberg. I was clinic director in the couple and family therapy program at Kansas State University. Recently retired from that. I'm now in private practice. I do some organizational consulting and AMFT approved supervisor, do supervision and chase a lot of grandkids around.
Diane?
Hi, I'm Diane Seibel. I'm the Director of Clinical Services for Ember Hope Connections in Wichita. I'm also a state approved supervisor in Kansas and Missouri. I too chase a lot of grandkids around, but primary work in child welfare and in addictions as well.
Great, thank you. Leslie?
Sorry. Hi, I'm Leslie Allen. I'm the Assistant Director and Licensing Manager for the BSRB. I have been with the board since 1999, and I'm happy to meet you all.
And Dave?
Thank you all. We've had communication over email, but it's nice to be able to put faces to names. And so my name is David Fye. I'm the executive director for the BSRB. So I do a lot of work directly for the board and supervise the staff here at the BSRB office in Topeka. And really excited to work with all of you on this very important committee. The advisory committees are I think, one of the main strengths of the agency. I think it's a great way for us to work as a composite board in Kansas, but also hear from the different professions regulated by the board and members of those professions. And so really appreciate you all volunteering your time and look forward to learning more about you today and then continuing to work with you at your service and look at advisory committee. So thank you for doing that. And if I can be helpful in any way or our office can, feel free to reach out to either Leslie or myself and we'll help you or connect you to someone who can.
Thanks, Dave. Stacy, we'll start with you as a new member.
Oh, thank you. Thank you everyone for having me on this committee. I'm excited about that. I am a program manager for Eastern Kansas Healthcare Systems through the VA in marriage and family therapy. So essentially handle all the marriage and family therapy referrals, consults, and even some training. I am a double AMFT approved supervisor, and I do that in my private practice, just basically doing just the supervision. I'm a state approved supervisor for both Kansas and Missouri. And I'm also a without compensation adjunct with Friends University as part of doing the internship program here in Eastern Kansas Healthcare. I did graduate from Friends University with my master's in family therapy, and I also have a certificate in sexual addiction treatment. And so I do a lot of work around that kind of experience for folks. So been in community mental health and worked for county government and now federal government my entire career.
Great, thank you. Appreciate you being here.
Yeah, thank you.
Renisha?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Rainisha Hunter. I am the owner of Hunter's Journey Family Therapy here in private practice in Wichita. I am also an adjunct instructor at Butler My first master's in MBA. So I teach intro to business at Butler. And then I also received my LMFT at Friends as well, cohort 55. And I chase a toddler around. I have a 3-year-old son named Jules. So I'm so happy to be here. Thank you so much for having me. And I look forward to getting to know you all throughout this journey.
Great, thank you. Welcome. This committee is pretty awesome. We do a lot of great work, so we're glad to have you join us in this. Dave, I'll hand it over to you, I think, for a short summary.
Okay, well, I just wanted to provide a little bit of information about some general advisory committee member expectations. And if Mary wants to add anything as chair of the advisory committee after that, that would be perfectly fine too. So as you kind of went through the advisory committee policy in preparation to express your interest in serving on the advisory committee, you went through some of the information. You know that these advisory committees meet about every other month for 2 hours. Most of the meetings are broadcast. What we would expect from members was that, in preparation for these meetings, if there's things that are asked between meetings, if there's any homework items per se, that you go ahead and review the documents in preparation for the meeting. Of course, that you would attend the meetings and also make your voice heard. Every member of the advisory committee has a unique perspective, a unique background and education. And so we really appreciate the blend on this committee and hearing from so many of you based on all your different experiences and everything that you have to add. So really encourage you to participate. In terms of other items from a technical nature, I want to let you know that we do yearly training for all advisory committee members and board members. A lot of that training goes through some of the technical information, but we also talk about sort of how the board has defined its scope of work, the role of the BSRB, and how the advisory committees fit into that process. So as you kind of become more familiar with your work in the advisory committee, review the expectations of board members document on the website. Even though you're not board members, it helps to kind of see how the advisory committees fit under that. There's also some language in the advisory committee policy that says the same processes and procedures that apply to board members. Most of those will carry forward to advisory committee members in terms of things like integrity, and certain information at times may be confidential. And so you want to make sure that you understand some of those types of things. In terms of sort of the legal side of things, as a state agency, there are some different requirements and rules that we have to follow compared to if you've worked with different associations or companies, perhaps. So as a state agency and a subcommittee of the state agency, we do follow the Kansas Open Meetings Act, and I referenced that in sort of the introductory information that I read at the beginning. And so one of the main takeaways for that is that if we have 3 things that are met, we need to do that information in a public meeting. And so if there is a majority of members of the committee and there is interactive communication, so back and forth discussion, and then it would be on a topic relevant to the work of the advisory committee, then that information, those types of discussions really do need to happen in a public meeting. And there's certain requirements that we will take care of on your behalf as far as putting out notice of the meeting and a format so members of the public can observe and things like that. But sometimes people think that just applies to a conversation in person or perhaps something like this over Zoom, but it could also really kind of go towards email communication too. So we can't have, if you're used to working with groups that you do a lot of work outside of the committee and then you kind of bring it to the committee, in this format, if it does involve a majority of members, that has to be done at the committee level during the meetings. You can't really do back and forth emails to members of the committee to prepare something. However, you can work with less than a majority of members of the committee. So if you notify a couple people with some questions, if you ever want to reach out to, the chair of the advisory committee, or, if you ever want to reach out to BSRB staff, that's perfectly fine. I don't want you to feel like you can't reach out to people. It just comes into play when you deal with the majority of members of the committee. And so just wanted to give you an early heads up about that important rule with COMA. And then as it deals with the Kansas Open Records Act, since you are working, as a subcommittee of a state agency, potentially your communications dealing with the work on the advisory committee could be subject to open records requirements. And so just make sure that in your communications involving the BSRB, it's usually good to tap either myself in or, perhaps Leslie, if Leslie is helping you out with something. So that way we can assist you with those things. And then also, since you're all professionals, you probably don't need this reminder, but I always like to remind people any communication you have could be potentially a record. So even though it can be easy to be casual sometimes in emails, always make sure that you use appropriate language and just be professional, which I'm sure, like I said, you don't need a reminder about, but it's always good to just have that touched upon for the Open Records Act. So in terms of the other things, I'll get into more details during the annual training. We'll have an opportunity and we'll talk about that a little bit later, but I just kind of wanted to outline the basic expectations for all members, and then just an early heads up on some of those legal technical issues. But I'll turn it back over to Mary, and if she had any other expectations as chair of the advisory committee, she can provide those, but welcome to the committee.
Thank you, David. That was a great overview. The only thing I would add is, as being new to this committee, if you have questions, even if we're in conversation with something, if you need to stop just to say, what does that mean? Or what, I'm not quite sure I'm understanding, please feel free to do that. Because I know sometimes as you're getting more orientation to something, it's harder to know all those things. So please feel free to do that. Okay, I am going to move on to the approval of the minutes from the last meeting from August 8th, 2025. If you've had a chance to review those in your packet, if there aren't any addition or changes or comments, I'll take a motion to approve.
I move to approve.
Thanks, Heidi. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Thanks, Betsy. All those in favor, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? Same sign. Okay, those are approved. And Dave, I'll hand it back over to you for your executive director's report.
Okay, thank you, Mary. I'll go ahead and provide some updates from recent board meetings and then talk about some legislative updates and then maybe touch upon some BSRB operations updates. So one thing we try to give you routine updates about, even though a lot of this is behind the scenes, we are in the process of switching over a licensing system to the state's new enterprise system under Acela. And so that will allow us to have some increased functionality, some more integrated processes. One of those will allow people to apply for licensure online. And as opposed to our existing format, which is a series of forms that people would select the right form and then print off and then send in, this would allow them to answer questions and that would kind of route them in the right direction, whether they would be applying for reciprocity, applying for an original application. So we're really looking forward to that. We think it'll be much more user-friendly and it should cut down on the timeline for certain applicants in terms of making sure, they don't skip a question, accidentally miss something. And so we are, I would say, about 9 months into a 2-year process of switching over to that system. The initial stages that we have been going through so far have been meeting with staff of the Office of Information Technology Services, having them understand all of our processes and everything that we're looking for. And now they are in the process of trying to build the system to meet our needs, not just for now, but also for the future. So it's exciting. We're really looking forward to this transition. We won't see it probably launched for another 1.5 years, I would guess, but really looking forward to that movement. So behind the scenes, Leslie has done a tremendous amount of work on that and other members of the BSRB staff. So really want to compliment them on their work and really appreciate our partners with OITS too. In terms of some legislative items, if you all are not familiar with the legislative process, basically most of the legislature's function happens during the official legislative session each year, which is usually about 90 days, beginning in mid-January and going sometimes until the end of March, sometimes into the end of April. I've seen it go into mid-June, but usually about 90 days. However, they choose to count those 90 days. And then they have bill hearings, they have committees, they review budgets, and then ultimately usually pass an appropriations bill and some other legislation. But when the legislative session is over, in the interim, they have committees that continue to meet that deal with certain topics. And I just want to put a couple of those meetings on your radar. If you are not following the health committee meetings, I think those could be of interest to you. There are a number of topics that are relevant to today and also the future of the state. One of the committees that has been meeting that's of particular interest to me is there was a House Select Committee on Government Oversight that has had a couple of meetings this interim, and they have focused primarily on some of the operations of the Board of Nursing, and they have looked into some of their processes, such as, what do they do when someone renews their license, or how can you reinstate a license? What does their disciplinary process look like? And do people have enough information about that process? And there was some criticisms by members of the committee, and this was public, so you can go back and watch those meetings. They're all on the legislative YouTube channel. But they were critical of the agency, perhaps for not sharing enough information about certain things with applicants, or perhaps not doing enough to help them know their license was going to expire, or perhaps a fairness aspect if they had let their license expire and then there were concerns about them continuing to practice after their license expired. So by comparison, they did reach out to us and a number of other health agencies like the Board of Pharmacy, Board of Healing Arts, to collect information about our processes. And I've been viewing those conversations and those meetings to see how we compare. And I think our processes are in a good spot. I think we can always learn from what they're talking about. And I think we should be responsive to any concerns the legislature is having. But in general, I think we do a good job of sending out those emails to people 9 months out, or actually 90 days out, 60 days out, and then 30 days out if someone's license is going to expire. And then we send out the letter that says your license is now expired, and it advises them, not to practice. And if they do want to practice in the future, they would need to reinstate their license. So I think those are all helpful. And I think there may be more uniformity on this process going forward after these committee meetings. There may be some legislation concerning the Board of Nursing or perhaps all agencies in the future, but we'll just kind of monitor that. So if you haven't had the opportunity to kind of read those documents, they're posted on the legislature's website under that committee. Again, it's the House Committee on Government Oversight, and they've met a couple times this interim. In terms of some other things, I always try to update the advisory committee about the recent meetings of the BSRB board. And so I'll just talk to you about a few items from recent board meetings. Generally, the board meets for 3 hours every other month, but once a year in the fall, the board likes to hold an all-day in-person meeting. And this allows the board the opportunity for board members to come together in person and really talk about items relevant to perhaps a legislative agenda or items that just need more in-depth discussion. And so for the last few years, we've really moved these meetings around the state. I've been working as executive director for the BSRB coming up on 5 years in the middle of November. And over that time, the first year we couldn't hold meetings in person because of the pandemic. So that was one format. And then in the following years, we've held that meeting in Kansas City, Wichita, Lawrence, and then this year we held it in Manhattan. And so that meeting was held on September 29th. Starting first, though, with the board meeting that happened on September 8th. One of the main items I wanted to make you aware of, the board is continuing to review the grid of unprofessional conduct regulations to go item by item to see if that language can be synced up between professions. So if you have not visited the board's website to see that document, I think it's a really nice document. It outlines the wording for each profession's items, and as much as possible, it shows them side by side. And so the board is having good discussions about those items and trying to sync up the language when possible, or determine if one of those items is missing for a profession. Is there a good reason why that's the case, or should it be added? So that'll probably continue through the end of this year and maybe through the beginning of next year a little bit. There were also some appointments to advisory committees. There was a discussion about the board partnering with a company called eBoss. And the eBoss is basically a company that works with licensing boards like the BSRB and makes available disciplinary resources. So when someone has committed a disciplinary violation for the board, there are corrective actions the board has as tools. And what this company would do would provide additional resources. So if someone had, say, had an issue with in the area of confidentiality. Currently, right now, the board could require continuing education. They could require the person to undergo supervision with a focus in that area. One of the things this company could do is they would have experts that could walk the person through sort of an education on that topic, and then ensure that they had actually learned from the experience by administering tests or going through, writing of a paper and then working through that with the person. The goal being that you would want someone who had a violation to be a better practitioner moving forward. And so the board did say that they were supportive of the disciplinary committee for the BSRB working with EBOS. And so we'll take some steps on that moving forward to have the complaint review committee learn a little bit more about the resources available, and then they'll have some additional tools. There was also some language the board talked about that has to do when a practitioner is practicing under direction. There are specific language in the statutes and regulations to notify clients when you're practicing under supervision, but there are some people that practice under supervision or direction, and direction is not side by side in all those situations. So the board expressed a desire to have a better conversation about that, and then to try to see if there's a way to be helpful in terms of that item. So moving to the board's out of town meeting on September 29th, we provided the board with some updates in terms of licensing trends. I'm happy to report that the licensing numbers continue to increase. We do expect at some point that will probably decrease, or at least the slope of increase will decrease because of the multi-state compacts. Those compacts have been designed as an alternative to traditional state licensure. And so what we expect is when more of those compacts go live, we will see individuals living out of state get a multi-state license instead of purchasing so many licenses in so many states. There's not a compact for every profession yet. I think there's interest across the board, but some of those will take a little bit more work to get up and running, so they're not immediate. So there is no compact for marriage and family therapy at this time, but I know that there's interest in a lot of practitioners. So we'll have to wait and see on that one. But happy to report that things are in a stable position in terms of the BSRB budget, although we are still working to implement a fee decrease approved by the board. We don't want to run into an issue to where we decrease fees and then have to very quickly increase fees. So we're working on modifying that language for the fee decrease in the regulation to put it in for a few years and then have it revert back, with the goal being that essentially if the board is not if the fee decrease is not endangering the balance in the BSRB fund, the board could revisit that and then add some language in the future to continue that fee decrease. But this would protect the board in case things were dropping too quickly. So we are still working on that fee decrease, but there was some additional language that was tweaked by the board at the out-of-town meeting. The board also reviewed some items that were previously recommended for legislation, but because of some technical issues primarily and issues with the legislative timeframe this past year, we were not able to have a bill run through the legislature. But the board went through those items again and expressed some interest in those items being put forward into a bill. One of those is an expansion of what the board was able to begin back in 2023, the student temporary licensed addiction counseling. And that's for individuals who have about 60 hours in addiction counseling or related field, but an emphasis in addiction counseling or related field, and they're on pace to become an addiction counselor. It was sort of the board's attempt to help get people into the workforce at a lower level and kind of create a bridge license for them when they're still taking classes to working towards that. So there was interest in continuing to expand who could qualify for that student temporary licensed addiction counselor license. There was also interest in a process that we had talked about to the board last year. Basically, if you are attending a academic program and this is mostly for programs outside of the state, and you're unsure if your program would meet the qualifications for licensure in Kansas, Currently, right now, there's no good way for us to review that program unless we get an applicant from that program. And so we can see an interest in programs wanting us to do a review, but it's not really a responsible use of our staff time to review programs upon request unless we have an applicant. So what this new thing would do would add language to the statute, and it would add a process by which we could review programs and provide an opinion back to a school for a fee that would basically say, we've reviewed your program requirements, your coursework requirements, and it's our opinion that your program does meet the requirements or it doesn't because you're missing these items here. And so that wouldn't be required from any program, but if they did want to do that for the assurance their program meets, we would now have a policy and a way to collect a fee to be responsible with use of staff time for that purpose. These would be things that would be going forward in legislation. So unless, they would still need to be passed by the legislature, but the board was supportive of these. There was also some language that we talked about last year as far as for each of the practice acts, there is a statute that basically says, creating licensure in this area is not meant to prohibit certain people from providing certain services. It's kind of a carve out in the practice acts. And one of the carve outs has been, having licensure for, let's say, for example, marriage and family therapist is not meant to prohibit students who are in an academic program for providing some services while they're students at the program. But there is some additional language in marriage and family therapy and also addiction counseling that would carve out, quote, individuals preparing for the practice of addiction counseling or individuals preparing for the practice of marriage and family therapy. And we can't find any real basis for that language, why it was added originally, or who it was intended to help, but it does create sort of an unclear standard of who would apply under that qualification. And so without a definition for that, what we had proposed last year was removal of that language from the statute, and the board was supportive of that for both addiction counseling and marriage and family therapy. So it would still leave the carve out for students or interns. It would only remove the language that is currently vague in reference to individuals preparing for the practice of marriage and family therapy. And then there was also some language to be added to the statutes to clarify in what cases someone can provide supervision for professional counselors who are seeking hours towards a clinical professional counselor license, and then also language being added to the statute to clarify who can be a supervisor for someone seeking clinical hours towards a clinical marriage and family therapy license. So for marriage and family therapy, the standard is essentially very similar, if not the same, than what it is right now, that if someone was seeking those hours, they would need someone who was a board-approved supervisor. And then there was some additional language that it would be a marriage and family therapist or someone who had met those qualifications for marriage and family therapy experience. However, under extenuating circumstances, which is a very high bar to meet under the board, you could potentially have someone from another profession meet those requirements. Under the new language for the professional counselors that is being proposed, it would essentially say, in general, if you are seeking hours towards a clinical professional counselor license, you would need to have half of your supervision hours from someone who is a board-approved professional counselor. However, upon request, you could have half of your supervision hours from someone who was a board-approved supervisor but was from another profession. And so that was an attempt to reach a compromise. We were hearing that there were a lot of employers that were wanting more flexibility in terms of who could provide those hours for individuals that they wanted to hire to gain those hours. And then additionally, we were having a number of applicants seeking clinical licensure that were requesting exceptions to the rule in terms of who could provide clinical supervision. But we were also hearing from the professional counselor profession that there was a strong interest in having professional counselors provide that supervision. So the compromise position that was initially recommended by the advisory committee and then recommended by the board was to maintain that half of the hours would be provided by a professional counselor. And then if others wanted the entire hours to be, they would be all professional counseling supervision hours. But in other situations, it would require that half the hours would be by a board-approved professional counselor, and then upon request, the second half of those supervision hours could be by a different supervisor who would be someone from another profession. So just kind of wanted to go through those. There was also a recommendation from the board to add a behavior analyst to the board. That is the only profession regulated by the board where there is not a board member for that profession. But over the years since we started licensing that profession in 2016, their numbers have increased. And I think right now they have somewhere close to about 600 licensees. So, so that was a recommendation by the board to add a 13th board member, a new board member for the behavior analyst profession. We also reviewed with the board the investigation policy. And so I mentioned those legislative meetings where they were critical of some of the policies for the Board of Nursing as far as their investigations, and questioned if there was enough clarity in terms of people understanding their processes. And I'm happy to report, upon our review, while I think, of course, we could always review more information and consider changes, the board adopted an investigation policy several years back, and we did a cleanup of that about 5 years ago. And that policy has been posted on the BSRB website. I think it outlines pretty clearly under what situations the board will do an investigation, what the board is looking for in those investigations. It also outlines who serves as a voting member of the Complaint Review Committee. And also it talks a little bit about the work of the investigators and how they will review that information. And then if there is a disciplinary finding, what the outcome would mean as far as what a consent agreement order is and what a summary proceeding order is. So it gets a little bit into the weeds. It's not a super lengthy document. It's only about 10 pages, but I think it does a nice job of talking about those really important jurisdictional issues and other things. And so upon review, the board, and I think in general, thought the document still looked really good as a guide. But I think the board wanted to make one change. So at the annual meeting, the board did make a change and recommended adding a sixth member to the Complaint Review Committee. So it would expand the CRC from currently 5 members to 6 members. And so I think at the next board meeting, there will probably be some discussion about who should serve as that 6th member of the CRC moving forward. But really good meeting. And then the last item I'll just comment on, in terms of the future of the BSRB, we've had a lot of really, in my opinion, good progress over the last few years. We've really tried to embrace modernizing technology and processes. We've really tried to go out there and represent the state well at national meetings and vote and make our voice heard and raise concerns when they were necessary, but also partner with individuals and build good things at a national level. And so I think we've done a good job over the last few years, but I think that there is still more room. I think we're scratching the surface on some of the issues. And so what we talked to the board about was if there was interest in putting together a strategic plan for the BSRB that would kind of not just talk about goals for the immediate future, but would provide a multi-year plan for the agency moving forward. And the board expressed a lot of interest and support for that. So over the next year, we're going to do the SWOT analysis, if you're familiar with strategic plans, and we're going to start to build that information with a goal of 1 year from today, having a strategic plan that will be officially something the board can use in terms of looking forward. And so really happy to work with the board on that strategic plan. So with that, I'll go ahead and end my report and see if there's any questions on any of those items I talked about.
Thank you, David. Any questions or comments?
I think I do. I don't know if I'm just out of curiosity. I'm intrigued by the professional counselor notion regarding supervision. Can I ask? I don't know what is required for social workers. Do they have to have a board approved? They do not.
Yeah. MFTs and the professional counselors are the only groups, the only professions that have a board approved supervisor designation. In fact, in a legislative session a couple of years back, social workers were putting forth legislation, and it was struck down by the legislative body, not interested in moving forward with something that would, I think there is a perception that it might be an increased barrier to people. And so that was, I think, while social work discipline is still interested, we're the only ones that have it. So as those conversations have developed with the profession, with the workforce issues and those kind of things, Professional counselors have seems to be a more limited ability to find supervision. And their committee took, much like our committee, we brought that question to our committee, and their committee decided that, while it's very important to them to make sure that supervision is provided by another licensed professional counselor, they felt like offering some flexibility in how those hours are obtained by adding an element of allowing other professions as long as they would be approved by the board.
Right. I might be looking at the field incorrectly. I often do. I think I asked because I had in my head, and this could very well be wrong, that it was largely the counselors that wanted to have the approved supervisor designation. So I was surprised to hear that. And then it seems like once again, and this is not a criticism, it just seems like it just seems like MFTs are now having, it sounds like kind of what feels like the highest standard for postgraduate supervision. Is it inappropriate for me to say that?
I don't think it's inappropriate at all. I think that's what our advisory committee is sort of charged with doing, is examining
Yeah.
that. But certainly it would be the case now that we have a higher standard than what's in place for the other disciplines.
I'm not necessarily arguing that we lower it. I just want to make sure I'm seeing the field as I look across the different mental health disciplines. I just want to make sure I'm understanding that properly. That's all.
Yes.
So thank you.
Mhm. Other questions or comments? All right, thanks, Dave. As always, a lot of work coming out of your office, and it's very nice to get the updates on all the progress that's being made. We'll move to the old business. This is in your attachment 7A, which is the combined draft survey of licensees. We had started with a couple of questions last time and wanted to move forward with examining our thoughts and comments under the negative issues involving telehealth. So in your packet, those are pages 17 and 18 and pages 48 to 53. So Dave, I'll hand it over to you if you want to provide any more context before we dive in.
Okay. Well, yeah, I thought Mary framed it perfectly. You recall this is a survey of the marriage and family therapy permanent licensees. So it does have both levels, the LMFTs and also clinical LMFTs. And we did separate out the responses from both groups. Our staff members had reviewed the responses, and they really helped quite a bit with drafting this report that you see in front of you, and trying to summarize some of the information. And we could start with that question that deals with telehealth first. But as you saw in the report, there is a summary of information, and it's attempt to summarize the responses in terms of negative issues people were seeing in the area of telehealth. And then in the back of the report, we wanted to allow members the opportunity to kind of dig into the details and to read the actual open-ended responses from the licensees who completed the survey. So I just want to turn it back over to you and see what struck you when you were reviewing the summary information or when you were reviewing those open field responses. Were there things that appeared to show a pattern where maybe we need to have more discussion and see if there's an area that we can brainstorm a solution or a recommendation to the board? Or were there things that you expected to see that maybe you didn't and it surprised you? So anything like that. But I just kind of, since you are all members, as I mentioned before, with unique experiences and unique perspectives, this is a great exercise to kind of hear what your individual thoughts were after reviewing some of this information. So I'll turn it over to you. Feel free to unmute yourself and then share your thoughts.
I thought it was interesting about lots of people asking for, well, okay, lots of people didn't ask for this, but it seemed like they needed to go one step further of like disappointment or challenge of like, oh, my client is moving or on vacation and I can't see them because they're not physically in the state. And then like then a few people mentioned like the AMFT coming up with a multi-state pack. But yeah, like I have for example, I have a client who moved and drives back into the state to see me, and that is totally appropriate, but I can't see them when they are in their other state. So I thought that was interesting, and I don't know what kind of control the board has, or if there's a way to lobby to AMFT about considering a multi-state pack, but that seemed to stick out to me quite a bit.
Thanks, Heidi. Anyone else want to share their thoughts as they were reviewing some of the information in the draft report on telehealth?
Is it an educational piece? Because some states do offer that opportunity if you apply to the state in which the person lives, and it's just a temporary, for continuity of care, to wrap up care, whatever the case may be. So I've had some supervisees or colleagues do that where they outreach the state. I would be also concerned about just kind of the leading education or safety risk factors and information that's communicated around telehealth, specifically when it comes to working with, I did see someone wrote about children and maybe whatever the presenting issue is for the family system, as well as couples. And when providing telehealth, there are some safety and risk factors in regard to intimate partner violence, and the threshold for providing telehealth is actually lower. And so it would be contraindicated to provide telehealth services for higher risk clients. And I don't know if there's something that can be done as far as educating people or having some kind of resource for that.
Yeah, nice thoughts. I kind of picked up the theme of this educational gap too, that people maybe haven't taken advantage of telehealth resources that you can access to make sure that your guiding practice is good. I also thought that was kind of strange. There's sort of this lack of evidence, but thought that it's less effective. So I think that's kind of interesting too. I think you can find research that suggests it's not that, but it might be the missing some of those other pieces in terms of the face-to-face nuance that you get. Other thoughts, comments?
I was trying to remember if it was in the comments that I saw this or another part of the survey regarding telehealth, but like navigating crisis type situations, which it was interesting because I had that happen with a student, MFT student recently, and we helped them through it and we got some things in place, but it was just interesting having that experience. And then I feel like I can't remember where it was at, if it was in a comment or something else related to telehealth, but just how to have like when you're doing telehealth, what I perceived it as is how to have like good boundaries with clients and communicate like from the get-go of doing telehealth sessions, that like this is how we would navigate, if you were in a crisis situation and we're on telehealth. And I'm trying to remember which page. I didn't write down which page it was on. I can't remember if it was some comments or if it was one of the questions. So that kind of stuck out to me a little bit. And I don't know if that's education or like what you're saying, Mary Jones, are they using some of the tools that maybe are out there to help structure like regular telehealth sessions with people? When the pandemic started, I don't know if we had really good structure to give to people. Like, hey, these are the things that you want to make sure of. I think that's gotten a lot better. But yeah, that stuck out to me.
Let me ask you about one item that I, sometimes mention at the beginning of these conversations, and I always think about. So the question asked, over the past 2 years, have you experienced any issues concerning telehealth, either through professional practice or observations of other practitioners? And for LMFTs, it's always interesting to me how many people say no. For LMFTs, it was 40 out of 54, which by my simple math is about 75 or so percent. So about 3/4 of people said I don't really see any issues, and I haven't experienced issues with telehealth in the last 2 years. Of course, we do want to note the issues that people are talking about, not necessarily overly magnify them in the context of all the results, but I think there are some areas that we can look at. But it was interesting to me for the MFTs how many said and I haven't seen any issues in the last 2 years with telehealth. And for the LC MFTs, 179 individuals answered the survey, and 122 mentioned they haven't had any issues, which is about 68%. And so, any thoughts on that? Does that kind of match the people that you talk to in terms of the circle of your colleagues as far as professionals? Is that kind of the sentiment that you are feeling that at least the majority of people seem to think that telehealth is going well and they're not really noticing a lot of issues?
I questioned some of those results. I thought that when I looked through it, because I know in the clinicians I supervise and in my practice and in others I talk to that everyone has had some issue with telehealth, whether it's trying, other people that are in the room, or somebody's trying to do the client is driving through drive-through while they're having a session, all of those things. So I don't know why that it would be that high that there weren't problems. What I'm also finding are clinicians who have been out for a while, therapists who are clinically licensed, have not had the training that some of our newer students have, who have come through the pandemic era where we all crash coursed how to do telehealth. And so I do think the continuing education, how to solve that, or as I was reading through that, I wondered, are the therapists not even aware that some of these things are problems, that there are client case issues that are contraindicated for telehealth, as Stacy mentioned. And so that was concerning to me too, that are there problems that just aren't even being acknowledged?
I
Good.
think, oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Chris.
I totally agree with what Marcy was saying. I was thinking to myself, our accreditors really require, I mean, they're really honest about making sure we're training into telehealth, covering telehealth ethics, just the practicalities of that. So it's very inherent in our training. And I just wonder if people who have been out longer might have had, I don't know how many people, I don't know how many CEUs are out there regarding telehealth. I mean, there probably are. I don't know how many people are going to those things. Or to Marcy's point, like running into issues that they may not even realize are issues.
Yeah, I would find it very hard to believe that there's not a higher number of incidents or things like that, and safety wise, driving, or inappropriate, engagement of behaviors, and just kind of treating, kind of what we do here is we ask our clients to treat the session like they were coming in. So no distractions, kind of setting those healthy boundaries. So I would also be concerned, just like what Dr. Haben said, is there are so many CEUs, and even through programs like Simple Practice that might offer those to their, companies that are subscribing to that, or through Motivo, which would be through the supervision aspect. So I think that there's so many outlets there, and I don't know. It just makes me think that maybe there should be some kind of requirement for like one CEU a year or something like that. We have it for supervision, we have it for safety and risk factors and other disciplines. But telehealth is also kind of branching out into a different realm of responsibility. And so maybe having an accountability to that.
Great comments. I don't think we've had a lot of discussion about where we want to go when we finish talking about the survey report. But I do think as you go through these things, when there are things that stick out, go ahead and find a way to note that in the report. And then when we get done reviewing the report at the end of our discussion, we can come back to some of those items, and maybe there's some area there for recommendations back to the board, or at least some thoughts to forward back to the board on behalf of the BSRB, I'm definitely listening. And one thing I didn't talk about that was an area of focus at the out-of-town board meeting was communication. And I think this was also kind of revealed from the survey results too. There was a question that talked about how familiar are you with the work of the advisory committee? And I think maybe not surprisingly, but across the board, the majority of licensees are not very familiar with the work of the advisory committee, even though, we've taken steps forward to launch the YouTube channel in January of 2021, and we have all those meetings not just broadcast live but archived. We put information on the website. We post news stories. We send out emails when a bill is passed. But there's still more room for more communication, and I think that was the message that we were picking up. And so we will have some creative ways to get more information out to licensees in the future, and we've had some good discussion about that. But um, it is interesting kind of hearing your comments, because also, yeah, and reading through some of this, there were a couple of concerns people had raised that kind of show that there is a little bit of a lack of confusion about, how much the BSRB can control in terms of individuals being able to practice across state lines. And so I think we will probably focus on a few of those items and maybe try to share some information so everyone can understand kind of the scope of things, and then we can all be on the same page. So. Any other comments about telehealth, or should we move to the artificial intelligence question?
Yeah, I think we're ready to move to the AI. So yeah, I actually wasn't too surprised with the AI piece, because I think it's sort of what everyone's saying. There's a lot of no's. Well, it's awful. Don't use it. But also thought there's probably people who don't even know, some of their systems have AI built in. And, when we're asking this broad AI question, which we've had a lot of discussion, I think some of them were clear, like maybe we use an ambient listening tool or something that helps us with notes. They may not even understand those are AI.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this is question 16 for both professions. On page 22, and the question says, do you currently use artificial intelligence in your practice? And if you do, in what areas do you use AI? And kind of what we've done with the other ones, there's a split between the responses from the LMFTs and the LCMFTs. And I agree with you, Mary. I think there's probably a lot of people that are using tools that have AI embedded into them that maybe don't realize they're using AI. Or maybe, they think of AI as one thing, whereas AI is actually a little bit more broad. And so, what about the rest of you? Do you have any thoughts on the summary information that we provided there, or the open field answers? And just to kind of frame that first point that I talked about for the telehealth, in terms of, do you currently use AI in your practice? For the LMFTs, 69 LMFTs answered the question. 54 reported that they do not use AI in their practice. So at least at the time they answered the survey, that was their response. And I know AI is changing fast, but earlier this year, 54 of 69 said they don't use it in their practice. For the LCMFTs, 207 or 227 LCMFTs answered the question, and 169 said they don't use it currently in their practice. So I think it's a pretty good majority for both levels of licensing, but I do suspect potentially those answers might be a little different given how quickly things have changed and people's familiarity growing with AI. But what do you all think about the responses that you saw here, or just your comments about open fielded responses, or anything struck you? So.
David, I agree with you. I think this is probably quickly outdated. I imagine if we did just a one question follow-up, a lot more would probably be saying yes, they're using it. Because I think there is a lot of, like what you said, Mary, people aren't even like comprehending that Grammarly is AI. Or when I go to ChatGPT and be like, make me a worksheet for coping skills, that's AI, and now there's this more awareness of what is AI, and it's not just a chatbot, because I think a lot of people are like, oh no, we can't use chatbots, but sure, make my coping skills worksheet.
Yeah, I echo everything you guys said. I even think I'm with one of the last comments about using augmented intelligence with Elios. Like you're starting to see that people understand, like that there are different iterations of AI and definitions. So I won't say anything more because I just agree and echo everything you guys both said.
There was a second part of the question that said, if you do use AI, in what areas do you use AI? Anything struck you about that part of the question or any of the specific AI resources people referenced?
I think that there's a difference between note taking and or note dictating and note creating. And that's just my feedback on. So I had a conversation with one of my supervisees. Come to find out that Simple Practice now has this ability. I don't have Simple Practice, but it has an ability to record the session and then it creates the note.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, I was like, oh, well, that's interesting. So I just feel like there's also some, importance to informed consent around that for sure. And where does that go?
Yeah. Our practice, we use Elios. We're a mental health center and we use it. But we discuss it with our clients, and anybody is willing to say that they don't want that to happen. And Elios does create the content, but it requires a clinician to review it. And so it's not like it's just in there and you're just moving on. It requires a human touch. Which is why we felt like it was going to be beneficial because it still required that, and they could make changes, but it's picking up on evidence-based practices and maybe even things that the clinicians didn't even realize that, oh yeah, like when I was doing this intervention, like it really does fall under that. And so it has decreased documentation quite a bit, but it does require a little bit of a human touch. I'd be curious, like if that's how some of those, I don't know about all of some of the augmented stuff, if that's how those, like with Simple Practice or with other ones, if it still requires somebody reviewing it before it gets billed out or not. I'd be curious about that.
Simple Practice does. I actually use it to see what it's like. And honestly, I'm kind of in love with it. Another thing that Simple Practice does that I don't know if Elios does this is they have a session summary or something like that where you click it in the appointment and it says like, this is what you talked about last session and this is where you're going. And yeah, like I think about how, yes, it does need that human touch, but also you're right. It points out that, hey, this is the kind of treatment you're doing and this is where you were headed. And I don't know, it's hard. It feels like a slippery slope of like, we're sort of teaching robots to do therapy. Which I don't believe that robots can ever fully do therapy because the relationship is the healing part of that. But I also think, and I've had some of my supervisees use it, of like building some confidence and like, oh my gosh, when I just played, Jenga with that kid, I was doing something therapeutic compared to just, I feel like I'm just sitting here playing, and giving them some confidence of like, you are doing therapeutic work and you are even able to then turn and say to a parent, well, when we played Jenga, this is what we were working on. So I don't know. I'm conflicted about it, but
The one thing
I
that's
kind of want to.
just real quick, one thing that I was going to say too is about that accountability of signing off on it and reviewing it, because I've seen in documentation from colleagues and other providers throughout the state in which even through previous dictation, they would put a disclaimer in there saying, well, I'm not responsible for the grammatical or spelling errors. I'm like, no, yes, you are. You are fully responsible as soon as you sign that note. So I think that being clear, if we're going to have any language, just being clear, as long as they sign it, they're still responsible, even if it's AI generated. So sorry, Renisha.
No, it's okay. I actually love that you brought up that confidentiality piece because I think about just the power dynamic when you're asking a client hey, I got this new tool and I want to implement this. Like, very likely will they say no. They're looking at you for the professional. And so there is this power dynamic when we think about, like, are they really okay giving consent to this idea that you're now introducing into the therapy space? So how do you hold space and honor both, trying to be efficient and effective with your notes taking, and then also holding space for our clients' autonomy and recognizing and honoring the power and privilege in the room as well.
Yeah, I think those are good points. And in some ways, we've sort of naturally segued into the next item. So I don't want to shortchange anyone if they want to talk about comments in the survey, but we were going to talk about our continued discussion on AI. So I don't want to transition too quickly. But we're sort of getting into that mode, I think, already ourselves, talking about that continued discussion on AI. So is everyone fine if I move into that discussion? Yeah, and it's interesting. I know Dave and I have been to a couple of meetings, and I'm sure you are all hearing this discussion about how do you regulate AI. And I think, one of the thing that sort of has risen to the top of that is making sure that I think everyone feels like there has to be guardrails, but can't be constrictive, right? Because AI is moving so much faster than what we could ever get through in statute or regulation. That I'm aware of, Illinois is the only state that has passed some legislation regarding the use of AI in mental health services. And from what I understand of that in the brief amount of time I've been able to look at that legislation, is that it's really protecting, ensuring that therapy is provided by a licensed professional versus in their state, versus by a chatbot. Right. We're hearing story after story, some pretty terrible, tragic stories about people who thought they were engaging with maybe even a licensed professional and we're actually engaging with a chatbot and not really having someone behind that. So that was one of the areas that I know we've been talking about, is making sure, how do we, if the board, is going to regulate this, what are the pieces we need to be thinking about? And I heard it said already, there's some like accountability pieces, right? That you sign off on your own work, that you are ensuring confidentiality, that there is an informed consent process. But other thoughts on this as we think about what should our role be in this?
I want to go back to what Rainisha said, since we are already talking about it anyways. I think you make a really good point about the power and control, especially if it's sold to, this makes my job easier. And of course, and then it turns you're taking care of me by signing this, compared to I'm here for you. And I think there is, I think that's something that should be considered when if and whenever like guidance is given to therapists. There is a power dynamic here that I don't think that I've quite thought of before, and so I think that's a really good point.
Thanks, Heidi.
Yeah, I'd be really interested to see. I'll have to go read what Illinois is doing, but I mean, and based on what you're saying, would really be interested to see more states move in that direction, to regulate that a little bit more. It sounds like, I mean, everybody on here agrees, I think, from what I'm hearing, that we don't agree with AI as therapists. You know what I mean? Like providing mental health treatment, and so it doesn't seem like that would be too hard of a discussion, but maybe it is. I don't know. So yeah, I'd be really interested to see us at least see what those recommendations could look like, and see if they would be something we could look at.
This may be totally unrelated, but I thought it was an interesting anecdote. I was visiting with a therapist and asked if they had taken the survey and done the survey a while back, and they specifically said that they had skipped this question. And David, I don't know how many people did, because they did use AI and were worried that because it hadn't been approved, that it might come back and haunt them. So I thought that was interesting.
It's interesting you bring that up, because I wondered about that. there were certain license levels when we asked questions about, how much of your daily work is in-person services versus how much of your work on a weekly basis, how many hours do you provide in-person services and how many hours do you provide remote or telehealth type services? And you know, since things have been opened up, at least since the pandemic began, um, people are allowed to provide telehealth services, but there were a number of people in certain license levels or certain professions that there was just higher than normal amount of people saying prefer not to answer. And I was wondering if those people were like, I'm providing it, but I'm not sure, one ways or another. And maybe it falls into the same category of what you were talking about with the AI, where they're like, I'm using it, but I'm not sure because this is still a murky area and so I don't know. It's a good question. And I think people have asked us, for specifics in terms of what is approved or what's not approved. And in general, we can't really get into too much of that because the board has not specifically come out with a policy on artificial intelligence or necessarily telehealth that like approves certain products or things like that. But I know practitioners are struggling with those questions and trying to interpret it. So definitely relevant, and we want to be helpful if we can be. In terms of this item on the agenda, I know we've had this listed as far as, were there any recommendations to provide back to the board in terms of regulation of artificial intelligence? And I didn't want to, remove this item from your agenda until you had the opportunity to hear from the licensees, because during this, process, while it's been on the agenda, you've had the ability to talk about it amongst yourself as an advisory committee. You've had the ability to seek maybe some guest speakers to talk about this. You've seen some reports from some of the associations or guidance from some of those associations, and now you've read feedback from licensees. So if you feel comfortable making a recommendation or wrapping up your discussion on this, that would be fine. If you would prefer to leave it on the agenda as kind of an ongoing thing to continue to get updates on artificial intelligence, that's fine too. So if you had any recommendations today, we could consider those to be forwarded back to the board. But since this is a topic that's changing, I think it's totally appropriate to leave it on the agenda so you can keep, discussing it at meetings as information changes and news comes to light. So, but any recommendations today? It sounds like there's kind of a consensus, and I've heard this in other advisory committees, that there needs to be some clarity in terms of making sure if you are using AI, that confidentiality is protected. There seems to be some consensus that there would be informed consent in terms of notifying clients if you are using AI. The one that I'm not sure if there's consensus or not, it seems like there has been a desire by certain advisory committees that if a practitioner is using AI, that perhaps there's the ability for a client to opt out of that being used. But I don't know if there's consensus for that being a requirement or just maybe that would be something for licensees to consider. So, was there anything I missed or anything more you wanted to add to that list, or you wanted to weigh in on any of those topics?
Yeah, about maybe not allowing chatbots, because there is such danger in those that they can be easily an echo chamber and encourage dangerous behaviors.
So to kind of add to that, Heidi, and I think this is maybe what you're saying, but I want to make sure I'm not putting words in your mouth. I think it's more of like us as clinicians not using a chatbot like as a part of our practice, right? I think it's so hard because there's just so many options out there. So and we're like, we can't regulate that, but we can make the recommendation at least that as MFTs, like within our practice, that we're not utilizing chatbots as a part of our practice. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, like you can't go to my website and click talk to a therapist and it's a chatbot type of situation.
That's great. That's what I think too.
What about the recommendation that, because I will recommend apps. And so then you take it outside your practice and then you say, hey, have you ever tried this chatbot? I would think that would be some accountability to your practice, what you're also suggesting or trying or using as intervention.
Yeah, Stacy, that's a good point. We've had some conversation about if you're recommending any ancillary or adjunctive tool, that you have enough knowledge about it to make sure that it's going to be safe for your client. So I think that's a good point. That has come up before. Thank you.
And I wonder if some of that too, and this, I don't know if this would be training, is, we like you said, Mary, having enough knowledge and saying like we're not the owner of this, like almost like, is there like a disclaimer that people put if they're going to recommend things, that because there could be changes that happen within that app that we're not aware of, that does include some things, or does there have to be some type of protection in place if we are recommending some of those things? And I don't have an answer for that. It's more of my questions as we keep talking about that.
I think with the risk, like our practice has risk and benefits in general, coming to couples or, any therapy, there's risk and benefits, and we kind of do that in the informed consent. And so if I'm recommending something, I'll usually talk about, well, I know there's known glitches, or, there's this. I do say, practice that at your own, risk, and we can come back and talk about it if there's any issues.
Well, it sounds to me, David, I'm hearing a little bit of both. Like, I think we are ready to make those, for sure, 3 recommendations back to the board in our examination of AI. And then also, I think it should stay as a topic because as it's changing, we might have some knowledge or come across something that we want to continue to work on if the board takes that in.
Great. That sounds great.
If you're okay with it, can we skip the discussion on alternative pathways to licensure? I want to make sure, since Leslie's here, that we go to the new business items and get the regulation, and also committee in full transparency. I'm going to try to end the meeting a little bit early because of a schedule conflict. So I'm trying to do both things or all things, but since Leslie's here, if that's okay, I'd like to hit some of those new business items. Okay, great. Okay, well, new business, part of what we've been doing is bringing regulations to this group to make sure that we are reviewing those and don't have recommended language changes. And so Leslie's here to help us kick that off. You have all of these in your attachments. We're going to start with 10254A, which is the applications for licensure. And Leslie, we'll just let you take this if you're comfortable.
Yeah, and before Leslie provides some comments on recommended changes, I'm just going to frame this for those of you that are new to the advisory committee too. One of the jobs of the advisory committee is to become familiar with the statutes and regulations for the profession, and we'll talk a little bit more about like the hierarchy of how those work. But these are what we have today is some regulations that have been in place for a number of years in certain cases, and you can see how long they've been in place. If you look at the very bottom, at the very end, it kind of shows when those regulations were implemented. So some of those, if you see, 2009 or even earlier, these have been in place for a while, and some of them have not been updated in a while, and maybe some of them don't need any updates today. But as Mary said, we've tried to bring these regulations to you all, and we've brought other ones already in terms of unprofessional conduct, continuing education, educational requirements for licensure, some of the meatier topics. But we would like to be able to inform the legislature that over the last few years, each of the advisory committees has had the opportunity to review all the regulations and provide any requested feedback on changes. And so that's what we're going to do today. We'll just go item by item. And Leslie has reviewed these and she has some recommended edits. But if you have any questions, we can also answer questions. If you have any recommended changes, we can also incorporate those today too. And then at the end, I will basically look to all of you to see, is there consensus for this item to be moved to the board with those recommended edits? And if there's no objections, then we can just go ahead and move it by consensus. So you don't need to do an official vote. If you're more comfortable doing a vote, you can, but that's since we have so many of them, and some of these will move really fast. Some of these regulations are only about a paragraph long. Others are longer. So we'll have Leslie walk through what she has spotted for recommended changes. And like I said, if you have questions, please feel free to vocalize those. I may not be able to see your hand when we're sharing the screen, and I'll share my screen here to look at the regulations. So feel free to just kind of unmute yourself and ask questions. But we'll go ahead and start with the first one. And yeah, like Mary, like you said, Leslie Allen, if you're not familiar with her, she's Assistant Director and Licensing Manager for the BSRB, and she's had a long history of writing a lot of these regulations in the first place, and she's very familiar with them. So I'll turn it over to Leslie, and I'll share my screen, and she can walk through the first one, which should be KAR 102-5-4A, applications for licensure.
Okay, so I really didn't see anything until E, at little e as in Edward. And in that, we need to change the temporary license from 12 months to 24 months because that's how long a temporary license lasts now. And then in E1, A, and B, it talks about that the applicant or the temporary license holder has to sit for the exam within the first 6 months. We have changed the statute and removed that requirement. It was really cumbersome trying to enforce that. And so those two things need to be stricken. That was the only thing I saw in this. I did note in the other professions, the post-grad hours were listed in this regulation, and in MFT's regulation, it just points back to that. So we might consider that for the other regs.
Okay.
It just points back to 102-5-7 rather than listing 3,000 hours and all of that. So.
Okay.
Well, I like
thought
that just because if it changes, you don't have to go back and change this again.
Exactly. I'm trying to make these notes as we go along because I won't remember because we've been looking at so many.
Well, and we should have some minute takers for these meetings too, so they can highlight these edits too. So. But appreciate you catching that. And for those of you, like we said, that are not used to reviewing these regulations and we're relatively new to the advisory committee, yeah, the advisory committee has made some changes to things in the last few years, the board as well. And so kind of syncing up the time frame for all those temporary licenses to make them all 24 months. That was something the board wanted to do with intention to give people more time to take the licensing examination. And I think in general, that has been really well received. And so this kind of is a little bit of housekeeping to make sure we're still syncing that up and having the correct language and the regulation to match the statute. So any questions from members of the advisory committee or any items that you had as far as other recommended changes?
If you're removing the part where they sit for the exam, where would that be documented that they sit for the exam and make sure that it's part of the application process?
So that is part of the requirements for licensure. This was just saying they had to do it in the first 6 months.
Okay.
So they still have to pass the exam, but it can be in 24, anytime in the 24 months.
So Leslie, you're saying this regulation just deals primarily with applying for licensure. There's a separate regulation that really gets into the educational requirements for licensure, which would reference passing that test.
Yeah, the statute requires that they pass the test. Yes.
Okay. Good question. Any other questions from members of the advisory committee or any other requested changes? If not, is there consensus to go ahead and move this item to the board for board review?
Yes.
Yes.
Any
Yes.
objections? If there's no objections, we'll go ahead and move that to the board. So thank you. And I'll share my screen again and we can go to the next regulation. And this will be KAR 102-5-4B. It's titled Application for Licensure Based on Reciprocity. And I'll turn it back over to Leslie.
Okay, so in lowercase b as in boy, to uppercase b, the information needs to be stricken after the first sentence. So it would just read on the date the date on which the applicant initially was licensed, registered, or certified, and as a marriage and family therapist, blah, 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 blah. And that they would show any subsequent renewals, reinstatements, or lapse in licensure or certification. And then after that, it's talking about if you're seeking licensure in a certain path, that you have to have been licensed for 5 years. That is not a requirement anymore. So we need to just strike all that language.
Before you move on to the other items on that one, just for clarity, for some of you that are new to the committee, when we talk about reciprocity, we generally mean someone who's licensed in another state, but it could be in another country, and then they're applying for licensure in Kansas, and there's a different path for that. Historically, I think there was a requirement of 5 years of practice in another state, and that was shortened to 48 of the past 54 months, so about a 4-year time period. And then back in 2021, the legislature passed a bill that's been referred to as universal licensure, which basically helped military members, military spouses, and individuals that resided in Kansas or intended to reside in Kansas become licensed through a reciprocity path that would only include having a license in another jurisdiction for 12 months. So the board had a lot of conversations. It wanted to be helpful for people, especially that were just across state lines that wouldn't qualify for it, and also to avoid confusion with the two different time periods for reciprocity. So the board passed, or was able to have a law passed that would lower the time frame for reciprocity from those 4 years down to 12 months to a 1-year time period to match it. And so that has allowed us to license a lot more people more quickly. And so that's been a really positive change. But this is kind of what Leslie's talking about. The regulation still references that previous time. And so this would be another housekeeping type thing to make it match. Leslie, did you see any other items in the regulation that you thought would need to be updated or changed?
Yes, in D as in dog, the verification.
Is this little d
That
or
needs to be changed. Yeah, big uppercase D.
okay?
And that verification that the standards have substantially equivalent requirements for license, or they have been licensed for 1 year with a similar scope of practice.
Okay. Okay. Any other items that you saw in this regulation?
3, so it's B3A, we need to strike. Because they don't have to show practice of that 5 years or 4 years of practice. And then that was it for that regulation, because the requirements for the clinical would remain the same. They still have the same options to show clinical competence.
Okay. And as I was mentioning earlier, at the bottom, it shows the last time this was implemented. So the last time this regulation was updated was 2003. So there's been a couple changes since then. I'll stop sharing my screen. Any members of the committee have questions about that regulation? If not, are there any other recommended changes for members of the advisory committee? If not, are there any objections from members of the committee to moving this forward to the board for review?
No.
Okay. If there's no objections, it seems like there is consensus, so we'll move this one forward too. So thank you for that. I'll share my screen again and we can move to the next item here. And this next one will be KAR 102-5-5. It's titled Examination for Marriage and Family Therapist or Clinical Marriage and Family Therapist. And I'll turn it back over to Leslie.
So I did not have any recommended changes, except I could not, I was thinking that the MFT committee had said they would be wanted to allow people, LMFTs who were working on the clinical license and hadn't passed at that clinical level, to sit for the exam again before they apply for the LCMFT, since it's the same exam. So if that is the case, that would be the only change that I saw.
Okay. And just to clarify that for the committee, this was originally brought forward by the Master's Level Psychology Advisory Committee. Essentially, their licensing test, the EPPP, if you get a 400 on that test, you would be able to get qualified for the Master's Level Psychology license. But to get a clinical license, you would need to get 3,000 hours over 2 years. and then you could apply for the licensed clinical psychotherapist license. The issue being is if someone, let's say, got a 499, they would not be able to qualify for the LCP, the clinical level license, and they wouldn't be able to take the test again for 2 years. And so potentially they would score worse on the test the next time they took it because they would have to wait 2 years. Whereas it would be helpful for them if they could take it again and get the score necessary. So for marriage and family therapy, it's the same kind of situation. To get an LMFT, you're taking the same test as you would for the clinical level. There's just two different pass points. And so we thought this would be helpful for individuals that were either an applicant for an LCMFT or individuals who had achieved the LMFT. They would be able to take the licensing exam without having to wait those 2 years and the accrual of the 3,000 hours. So that way you wouldn't have to wait and potentially do worse on the test because of having to wait that 2 year time period. So Leslie was talking about adding language to clarify that. Any questions from members of the advisory committee?
I really like that addition. Thanks, Leslie, for pointing that out and wanting to clarify that. I think that's great.
Yeah, the studies have shown that the longer you wait to take a test when it comes to licensing across most professions, you tend to do worse. And that makes sense because you get into work and you forget things. And so if it comes to a clinical test that is a separate test based on work out in the field, that's a little bit different. But if it's based on things that you learned in an academic setting, better to take the test early. And so this is a positive change. I agree. Any other recommended changes from members of the advisory committee? If not, is there any objection to moving this forward to the board?
With the new language or without?
With the new recommended changes.
Okay. Yeah, I support that.
Okay. And just, yeah, good question. If there's no recommended changes, we may come across a regulation where Leslie has reviewed it and she said, I just don't see anything needing a change. And in that case, we would just say, we'll just, is it, consensus of the advisory committee to just leave this regulation alone for right now. So looks like there was consensus to move this to the board. So we'll go ahead and do that with the recommended changes. And so we'll move on to the next regulation. And this next regulation here, it's listed as number 4 in the packet. It is KAR 102-5-6A, licensure without an examination. And I'll turn it over to Leslie.
So this actually just needs to be revoked. I believe it was written active in 97, and it says on or after January 97 and before July 1998, they can qualify for licensure without an exam. We don't have it's past 1998, so we don't really need this one anymore. I think it was when they started licensing from registration for LMFTs.
And it looks like this one did become effective in 1997, so that would make sense. Okay,
Yeah.
So in this case, that is another option I didn't mention, but that is another option. If there is a regulation that is no longer necessary and no longer helpful, we could revoke that. And I think some members of the legislature would be very appreciative of that because there is an interest in making sure we're being good custodians of these regulations and revoking them if they're no longer necessary. So any questions about the recommended edit to revoke this one? Any other recommended changes? I guess if we're revoking it, there's really no other things you can modify. Okay, well, is there any objection to moving this forward as a recommended regulation to revoke? Okay, if not, then we will go ahead and move it to the board and move on to the next regulation. Thank you. Okay, the next one is listed as number 5 in your packet, and that is KAR 102-5-9, renewal and reinstatement. And so there is a statute on this process, but there's also a companion regulation which helps clarify some of the details of both of these processes. So I will turn it over to Leslie and she can walk through this one with any recommended changes.
You know what? I missed that on my list. I apologize.
Okay.
So
well, that's okay.
I don't think I don't think we had any big changes though, because it's still, it, unless there's language about renewing late instead of reinstating, a license, I don't think that anything has changed.
Okay, let's go ahead and just table this one. And then we can kind of revisit at the next meeting. If there's nothing to change, there's no need to move it forward, but let's just go ahead and table this one and then we can pick it up at the next meeting.
Okay.
Move on to number 6 in your packet, and that is KAR 102-5-9A, the renewal audit. And as you may be familiar with, 10% of our licensees are audited when they renew their license. And there is a regulation which helps with the audit process. And so I'll turn it back to Leslie and she can talk about that regulation.
The only changes in this regulation would be in C2, striking original and saying copies of the CEU certificates. We have changed the requirements and changed our forms because we started using CE Broker as a way to track your continuing education. So we want to strike original certificates and add language about us being able to go into another system and review audits if someone is a member of CE Broker.
And
Those
yeah.
were the only two.
Thanks, Leslie. And yeah, that original language was something we've seen from other professions too. And it does date back a few years when a lot of stuff was just very specific and mailed back and forth. So this is more appropriate with the change of scanning and having things available electronically. So any questions about the recommended changes here? Sorry, Mary, I saw that you're muted.
Yeah, I thought I was just leaving it on. Are we specifically wanting to name CE broker in a regulation? Okay, I just wanted to make sure in Leslie's comments that because we can look at view documents, we wouldn't want to write that into, okay, then I'm good.
Yeah.
It's Dave gave language before, but about it being a system, but not specific to CE broker.
Yeah, something like a third-party platform approved by the board or something like that. And so that would allow us to move things back and forth or have us access the same documents from CE Broker if someone has activated their account and is using it for that purpose. So any objections to moving this item forward for board review? I don't see any, so it appears to be consensus to move this item forward. So we'll go ahead and move that forward for the board. So I'll share my screen again and we can move to the next one. And this next one is item number 7 in your packet. It is 102-5-13. Licensee consult with physician when determining symptoms of mental disorder. And I will say this is not a section of the law that we talk about very much. At the bottom of these regulations, one thing that could help you as you're reviewing these and becoming more familiar with some of the statutes and regulations, the regulations at the bottom say they're authorized by KSA supplemental, these number here, 74-7507. That is the statute by which the board has authority to essentially govern this area of the law. And then there's also another statute that's referenced here, 65-6404. And this is the statute that really talks about this topic in more detail. And so after that, potentially this regulation could be amended at different points. But if you ever want to look back, just say, I'm not as familiar as I could be with this regulation, but if it's necessary linking back to a law, you can go and look at KSA 65-6404. And some of that language in the statute should basically inform the board or the advisory committee why we have jurisdiction over this area. So if this is one of those items that you're not as familiar with and you may not feel comfortable with discussing at this meeting, I know some of the advisory committees have tabled it to allow their members the opportunity to review the statute and become a little more familiar with some of this language. But I'll ask Leslie if she has any edits today. And if you don't feel comfortable moving this forward right now, I totally feel comfortable if you wanted to table it and review it a little bit more before next time. So, but Leslie, did you have any edits on this one?
No, this is one that I was going to recommend the committee review and determine if there's any language changes that are necessary.
Okay. Well, I think that's a pretty good idea. And I would say that statute that I referenced, the KSA 65-6404, if you're wondering where to find the statutes, on the BSRB website, there's a drop down, and any statutes relevant to the professions, you should be able to see listed there. Those will link to the Revisor of Statutes website for the most current version, or you could go directly to the Revisor of Statutes website and link for that. But if I recall correctly, that statute concerns a few different topics. So as you're looking for the language relevant to this regulation, you may want to look closer to the bottom of that statute for reference. So let's go ahead and table this one, and then we'll move on to the next one, and we'll just kind of circle back to this in the next meeting. The next
Mary,
one,
are you okay? There's two left. Okay.
yeah, and I'm
Sorry,
keeping an
go
eye on
ahead.
the time. That's okay. We'll definitely make sure that we hit the target, I think. This one is number 8. It is KAR 102-5-14. This is designation of referral source for use in the diagnosis and treatment of mental disorders. And Leslie, do you want to explain the recommended edit for this one?
Sure. So the DSM-5 now has a DSM-TR, and the statutes say that the MFTs will use the current DSM as defined in regulation. So we can't just say the current DSM. So we need to update this to say DSM-5-TR.
Any members of the advisory committee have any questions or any other recommended changes for this one? This one's a pretty short one.
I do have a question. Does it require that we list it, or can we just put in there that it's the current DSM so we don't have to keep changing it?
It's a good question, and I think I can handle this answer. So I think at times there has been some concern by the legislature concerning what is included in certain versions of the DSM, because certain things have changed over time in terms of what is defined as an impairment or a disorder. And I think sometimes those conversations can get into politics for certain individuals. And so I think because of some of the historical way that things have changed or been viewed as a disorder or not a disorder, I think the legislature on this topic specifically wanted to maintain oversight, at least to have the opportunity to ask questions about it and review it. And so there's also the issue of sovereignty, where, sometimes we don't name a specific item because then we don't have control in the future if they were to make changes that we may not specifically agree to. So I think it's both issues. One, but that's part of the reason why our professional conduct don't adopt the ethical standards for the associations necessarily. We look at them and we borrow some of that language, but we don't necessarily adopt the ethical codes. But in this situation, I think it's a very specific reason, from what I understand, given the history of the DSM, that the legislature wanted to maintain some oversight anytime that the board wanted to go ahead and modify it to a certain version. But good question. And other advisory committees have asked the exact same question, and it would be more efficient, but I think that would be an issue. So any other questions or recommended changes from the advisory committee?
Is that, can I see, I didn't have it pulled up, so could you share the screen again on the,
Sure.
I'm just curious.
Yeah, this was last amended in 2019 for it to reference the 5th edition.
Okay.
And if you think you may have additional questions on this, and this is one that you'd want to table, that's appropriate too, if you want to circle back around to it at the next meeting.
I just know that there's things that are not in the DSM that I do use diagnosing, so I use the ICD-10 or ICD-11. And so just curious as how that's written.
Yeah, we can maybe bring a copy of the statute next time too to kind of provide that for clarity as well. So is this one that you would all like to table, or do you feel comfortable moving it forward with the recommended edit? I'll ask it a different way. Is there any objection to moving it forward with the recommended edit that Leslie had offered?
No.
No.
Okay.
No objection.
Looks like there is consensus, and I think we're getting close to time. So how about if we just go ahead and table any remaining regulations, and we can just review those at the next meeting?
That sounds good.
Thank you for your work. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I appreciate the indulgence of letting this meeting end a little bit early. The next meeting is December 12th, 10 a.m. So hoping that we can see everybody there. We'll bring forward the items we left and make sure that you have the available statutes to look at. So if there's anything else we want to reference, we can do that. If there's nothing,
Can I pause you just really fast? David, I've been looking for that email about training. Have I missed it or is it not out?
It's a great question. I have not set those dates yet. I intended to after the last meeting, so you should be receiving something in the near future. I'll pick 4 dates and send that out, but you didn't miss it. So
Okay, great.
those just have not been scheduled yet. But thank you for asking about that.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, go ahead, Mary. We can leave.
That's okay. That's all right. Thank you. Thank you for that. Thank you all for your work today, and I appreciate your time and effort in serving on this committee. If anyone's willing to, I'll take a motion to adjourn for this committee today.
I'll move to approve or to adjourn.
Thanks, Heidi.
I will second.
Thanks so much. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
All right. Thank you all so much. Have a great weekend.
Thanks.
Thank you.